She traveled 300 miles to start a new life and was rejected in front of an entire town before she even unpacked her bags. No warning, no apology, just a man's cold eyes sweeping over her like she was something he'd ordered by mistake and wanted returned. The crowd watched. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. And Elena Whitlock stood in the middle of that dirt street with her single trunk, her best dress, and every ounce of dignity she had left, which, in that moment, felt like almost nothing at all. This is the story of what happened next. If you're watching from wherever you are right now, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, stay until the very end, because I promise you, what Elena does before this is over will make your jaw drop. The stagecoach had been Elena Whitlock's home for 11 days. 11 days of dust in her teeth, of the wooden bench's hard edge cutting into the backs of her thighs, of the same 4 passengers. A salesman who smelled of camphor, a widow traveling to her daughters, a young soldier with a healing wound on his forearm, and Elena herself, shifting and sighing and pretending they weren't all miserable together. 11 days of waking up before sunrise and watching the landscape change outside the cracked leather curtain from the flat prairie, she knew to something she didn't recognize at all. Hills first, then slopes, then the blue-gray shapes of real mountains pushing up against the horizon like the earth had decided to make a point. She told herself the nervousness was normal, that any woman would feel it, that what waited at the end of the road was simply a beginning, and beginnings were always uncomfortable, the way new shoes were uncomfortable, tight in wrong places, needing time to break in and soften, and eventually become something you didn't notice anymore because they fit. She had repeated that to herself many times in 11 days. The letter from Franklin Holt had arrived at her sister's house in late September. 3 pages in careful handwriting on good paper, which had impressed her more than it perhaps should have. He had described himself as an established man, a rancher with 120 acres of decent pasture and a house with glass windows, which he mentioned twice as if glass windows were the marker of all a man had achieved. He was 38. He had been married before. His wife had died of fever 2 winters back. He needed a capable woman. He was not, he wrote, looking for anything complicated. He wanted someone hard-working, sensible, not given to complaints or what he called theatrical moods. He had heard of Elena through a matchmaking correspondence service out of St. Louis. He thought, based on her profile, that she might suit. She had read that word 3 times. Suit. Like she was a garment being considered. Her sister Margaret had thought the letter was promising. He sounds practical, Margaret had said, which in Margaret's world was high praise. And he has glass windows, Elena. Glass windows in a frontier house. That's not nothing. Elena was 29 years old, which in 1883 placed her firmly in the category of women people worried about. She had been a school teacher in Illinois for 6 years, had taken care of her mother through 2 years of slow decline, and had emerged from that period of her life thinner and quieter than she used to be, with a kind of worn patience that people sometimes mistook for contentment. She was not discontented exactly. She was just aware, in the way you become aware of a splinter you can't quite reach, that the life she was living wasn't quite the one she'd intended. So she had written back to Franklin Holt, carefully, honestly. She described herself as she was: medium height, brown hair, not fashionable but neat, capable in a kitchen, experienced with children, not afraid of hard work. She did not describe herself as beautiful, because she wasn't, particularly. She had a face that people called kind, which was either a compliment or a consolation depending on who said it and how. She told him about her teaching. She told him about her mother. She did not tell him that she was sometimes lonely in a way that felt like a weather condition, like something that settled in and changed the light. He wrote back within 3 weeks. The arrangement was agreed upon, and so Elena Whitlock had packed what she owned into one trunk, said goodbye to Margaret and Margaret's husband and Margaret's 3 loud children, climbed into a stagecoach, and traveled 300 miles toward a man she had never met and a life she could only imagine. The town of Hatchet Creek appeared around a bend in the road without warning, the way small frontier towns always did. Suddenly, as if the landscape had been hiding it, Elena pressed her face closer to the window and tried to take it in. A main street that was really just one street, wide enough for wagons to pass each other, lined on both sides with wooden buildings in varying states of upright. A general store with a painted sign faded to near illegibility. A saloon with a horse tied out front even at this hour of the morning. A small church at the far end. A livery stable. A building that might have been a doctor's office or might have been a barber shop. She couldn't tell from this distance. It was not a beautiful town. She had not expected a beautiful town, but there was something about seeing it in reality. This specific and unremarkable collection of wooden buildings in front of actual mountains that made her stomach tighten in a way the imagination never quite managed. People came out when the stage stopped. That was still the way of it in small towns. The arrival of a coach was an event, something to step outside for, to shade your eyes and watch. Elena could see a handful of men on the boardwalk, 2 women in aprons who'd come out of a shop together, a cluster of children who'd materialized from somewhere the way children always did. She smoothed her dress. She checked her hair with her fingers. The road had done what it always did to hair, and gave up on that and straightened her collar instead. She picked up her small traveling bag from the floor and waited for the driver to open the door. When she stepped down into the street, she saw Franklin Holt immediately. Not because she recognized him, they had never met, but because he was the man standing at the front of the small crowd with the look of someone waiting for something specific. He was taller than she'd pictured, broader in the shoulders. His face was weathered and not unkind at first glance. He wore a good coat and a hat with a flat brim. He looked, standing there in front of his town, like a man who was comfortable with being looked at. She walked toward him. She was aware of the watching eyes, the small crowd, the quality of attention that felt different from ordinary curiosity. She kept her chin level. She extended her hand. "Mr. Holt," she said, "I'm Elena Whitlock. It's very good to finally—" She stopped because something had happened to his face. It was subtle, the kind of thing you might miss if you weren't looking directly at him, or if you were the sort of person who looked away when things became uncomfortable. But Elena had spent 6 years in front of classrooms full of children and 2 years watching her mother's face for signs of pain, and she had become very good at reading faces whether she wanted to or not. What moved across Franklin Holt's features in that moment was not pleasure or relief or even the ordinary awkwardness of meeting a stranger you'd agreed to marry. It was something more unpleasant than that. Disappointment, immediate and unguarded. He looked at her the way a man looks at an item he'd ordered from a catalog and finds, on arrival, isn't what the picture suggested. Just for a moment, just a flicker. But she saw it. She felt it land somewhere in her chest the way cold water feels when it hits without warning. "Miss Whitlock." His voice was measured. He did not take her hand. The silence lasted long enough to be noticed. People on the boardwalk stopped their conversations. One of the children said something and was shushed. "I need to be direct with you," Franklin Holt said. Not quietly, not with any particular effort to spare her the audience. He spoke at the same volume he'd used to address any public matter, and she understood then that for him, this was a public matter. "I find that you are not—" He paused, chose his words with the deliberateness of a man who has rehearsed them and is now performing the rehearsal. "You are not what I expected." Elena felt the street go very still around her, or perhaps that was just her own hearing narrowing down, the way it does when something important is happening and the body instinctively mutes the background. "I beg your pardon?" she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her. "I was led to believe—" He stopped again, looked at her with that sweeping, assessing look that she would spend a long time trying to forget. "I was led to believe I was corresponding with a different kind of woman. A younger woman. Someone more—" He made a small gesture that encompassed her without being specific, which was somehow worse than specificity would have been. "Suitable." The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. She heard it, felt it, understood it completely. He was not confused. He was not mistaken about her identity. He had looked at her age, at her face, at her worn traveling dress, and her one trunk and her hand that he hadn't taken, and decided in the space of 30 seconds that she didn't meet his standards. And he was saying so here, in this street, in front of these people who were all now very quiet and very present, because it had not occurred to him to spare her, or because he'd decided that sparing her was not his obligation. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Elena said. The words cost her something, but her voice held. "The arrangement, Holt said, with a kind of finality that suggested he was wrapping up a business transaction, will not be moving forward. I'll ask someone to direct you to the boarding house. I'll cover the cost of tonight's lodging. A pause. It's the right thing to do. He said that last part like he deserved acknowledgement for it. Like one night in a boarding house was a fair trade for 300 miles and 11 days and everything she'd put her hope into. She didn't say anything. She didn't trust herself to say anything that wasn't going to embarrass her worse than he already had. She simply stood in the street with her traveling bag in her hand and her trunk on the ground behind her and watched Franklin Holt turn and walk back toward the crowd, which parted for him and then closed again like water after a stone. And then she was just standing there, alone, in the middle of a street in a town she didn't know, with a crowd of strangers who were looking at her with that particular mixture of pity and fascination that people reserve for accidents and humiliations, because the two are not so different. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke to her. The women in their aprons had gone still. The children were watching with wide, guileless eyes. A dog had wandered into the street and sat down a few yards away and was watching her too, which was, absurdly, what almost broke her. She would not cry. She had decided that before she fully knew what was happening. She would not give this street that. But she didn't know what she would do instead. The boarding house option, his charity, framed as decency, felt like swallowing something bitter. Staying felt impossible. Going felt equally impossible because there was nowhere to go. She had $3.40 in her bag, enough for the stage fare back east, but barely. She had no job waiting. She had Margaret's house, which had no real room in it, and where going back would mean explaining this, would mean watching Margaret try not to say "I told you so" while clearly thinking it. She stood in the street and counted her breaths and tried very hard not to let her face do anything at all, which was the most exhausting thing she had ever done. That was a low thing he did. The voice came from her left, and it was quiet. Not meant to carry, the way Holt's words had been meant to carry. She turned. The man standing a few yards away was not someone she'd noticed before, which probably meant he'd been there all along and simply hadn't made himself noticeable. He was tall, taller than Holt, and broad in the way of someone who does physical work rather than the way of someone who is simply large. He wore a coat that had been good once and was now very used, and boots that told the same story. His hair was dark and on the longer side, pushed back from a face that was weathered in a more thorough way than Holt's. The weathering of someone who spent most of his time outside, not just some of it. He was holding his hat in one hand. He hadn't been holding it before. She was almost certain. He'd taken it off sometime in the last few seconds, which was so small a gesture of respect that it almost escaped her notice, and then didn't. "I didn't ask for your opinion," she said. Not unkindly, just carefully. She had no way of knowing yet what kind of man this was, or what his commentary was going to cost her. "No," he agreed. "You didn't." He didn't seem bothered by the correction. He looked at her directly, which was different from the way the rest of the crowd was looking at her. They were watching. He was seeing. There was a distinction, and she felt it without being able to name it. "My name's Ronan Voss. I've got a cabin up on the North Ridge. Not much. It's rough living up there. But it's a roof, and it's empty space, and you're welcome to it until you figure out your next step, if that's useful to you." She stared at him. "You don't know me." "No. I could be anyone." "You could be," he said. "You could also be a woman who just got publicly humiliated in a street for no reason she earned, and who's standing here trying to work out her options with more composure than most people would manage." He put his hat back on, adjusted the brim. "You don't have to decide right now, but the offer's there." From behind him, from the group that had been watching, she heard a man's voice, not Holt's, make a low, amused comment that she couldn't fully make out but understood the shape of. Something about Voss, something that was not charitable. 2 or 3 people laughed briefly. Ronan Voss didn't turn around. He didn't change his expression. He just kept looking at her and waited. The thing about that, the stillness of it, the way the mocking behind him seemed to find no purchase on him at all, was what made her take him seriously. It wasn't courage, exactly. Or not performed courage, the kind that announces itself. It was just an absence of caring what those particular voices thought, and that absence looked from the outside exactly like security. "How far up is this ridge?" she asked. 2 hours on horseback, 1.5 if the weather holds, and we move." She looked at the sky, looked at her trunk, looked at the watching crowd, and then, deliberately, away from them. "I'll need my trunk brought up," she said. "I've got a mule." She nodded once, the way a person nods when they are making a decision they aren't entirely sure about, but are making anyway because the alternative is worse. "Then I suppose I'm accepting your offer, Mr. Voss." "Ronan," he said. "Elena," she said. And that was how it started. He was not a talkative man on the trail. She'd picked that up within the first 15 minutes, and she'd decided it was fine. She was not in a state for conversation anyway. She was in a state for looking at the backs of her hands on the saddle horn and thinking in small, controlled increments, not looking too far ahead. He rode ahead of her on a dark horse that was larger than the one he'd arranged for her from the livery, leading the mule with her trunk roped to its back, and the silence between them was not unfriendly. It was simply quiet. The trail climbed steadily. Hatchet Creek dropped away below them as the switchbacks lengthened the distance, and she found herself watching the town diminish in a way that should have been discouraging but was instead something else, something closer to relief, which surprised her. The pines closed in. The air changed character, going colder and sharper and cleaner than valley air, and she pulled her coat tighter and looked up through the branches at a sky that was high and pale blue and without a single cloud. At one point, Ronan slowed until she drew level with him. "How are you doing?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said automatically. He looked at her for a moment. Not the way people look when they're waiting for you to elaborate, just a look that said all right, and then he turned back to the trail. She appreciated that more than she expected to. "Can I ask you something?" she said, maybe 20 minutes later. "You can ask." "Why did you do that back in town? You didn't have to say anything." He thought about that for longer than she expected. The trail narrowed briefly and they went single file again, and she thought maybe he wasn't going to answer. Then he did. "Franklin Holt's a man who cares a lot about how things look," he said, "about what he's owed, and what matches his idea of himself. He's done well enough out here, and that's made him think his opinion of things is more correct than other people's." A pause. "It isn't, particularly. That still doesn't explain why you offered me a place to stay." Another silence. The mule complained about something, and Ronan adjusted the lead rope without looking back. "Because you didn't run," he said finally. When he said what he said, a lot of people would have. "You just stood there and took it without falling apart, and that takes something. It seemed to me like a person with something like that deserves to have somewhere to go." She didn't have a response to that, so she didn't offer one. She looked at the mountain trail ahead and the pines and the sky, and she thought about standing in that street and counting her breaths and not crying. And she thought about how strange it was that the smallest things about you sometimes became visible to strangers before they became visible to yourself. The cabin appeared when they crested a long, wooded slope, and the trees opened up briefly into a natural clearing. It was not impressive. That was the first and most accurate thing to be said about it. It was a single-room structure, maybe 20 feet by 20, built from heavy logs with the chinking in varying states of repair, with a covered porch that ran along the front and a stone chimney at one end. The roof was functional. The windows were small, one on each side of the door, no glass, shutters instead, one of which hung at a slight angle. There was a woodpile against the south wall that was substantial and neatly stacked, which told her something. A small storage shed stood off to the left. The clearing itself was ringed by spruce and fir, and beyond it and above it, the mountain continued upward toward a ridgeline that was visible only as a break in the trees. It was rough. It was clearly the home of someone who lived alone and was not trying to impress anyone. "I know it's not," Ronan began. "It has a roof," Elena said. "It's not a dirt street in front of a crowd of strangers." She looked at him. "Right now, those are the only two things I'm asking for." Something in his face shifted. Not a smile, not quite. Something that was on the near side of a smile and didn't need to cross over. He dismounted and began to untie her trunk from the mule. She got down from her horse and stood for a moment in the clearing, feeling the cold mountain air on her face and the solid, unfamiliar ground under her feet. And she looked up at the cabin. Her temporary home, not hers, belonging to a man she had met 3 hours ago. And she thought, with a clarity that almost frightened her, "Well, here you are." She did not think it kindly or bitterly, just plainly. Here she was. The inside of the cabin was what she'd expected. Spare, functional, not dirty, but not clean in any careful sense. A single iron stove against the back wall, a work table with some basic tools on it, a bed frame with a reasonably good mattress in one corner, a smaller cot folded against the opposite wall that she assumed was where Ronan himself slept when he had no company, which was probably always. 2 chairs at a table in the middle. Some shelving with canned goods, some bulk dry staples in sacks, a few cooking implements that looked well used. A rifle on wooden pegs over the door, a coat on a hook beside it. On the floor by the stove, a worn rug that had been good once. Everything in the room existed to serve a purpose. Nothing was decorative except, on the shelf above the canned goods, a single small carved wooden figure. A bird, a hawk, or an eagle, carved with real attention and skill. She looked at it for a moment and then looked away before he could notice her looking. "The cot's yours," he said, carrying her trunk in and setting it against the wall. He moved with an economy of effort that she found steadying, every action purposeful, nothing wasted. "I sleep in the storage shed when I need to. Got a sleeping area set up out there. It's fine." "I'm not putting you out of your own. You're not," he said simply. Not dismissively, just conclusively. He set the trunk down and straightened up and looked at the stove. "I'll get the fire going. You've been on a stage for how many days?" 11. "Then you're tired." He moved toward the stove. "There's water in the barrel outside. I'll fill the kettle." "I can do that." He looked at her. "I know you can." Then he went outside. She stood in the middle of the cabin, this strange man's home, in the mountains above an unfamiliar town, and put her hand flat against the rough log wall and pressed until she could feel the grain of it through her palm. It was solid. It was real. It was right here. She breathed out slowly, letting her shoulders drop from wherever they'd climbed to. She had made it through the day. Tomorrow she would think about what came next. For right now, that was enough. He came back with his kettle and set it on the stove without ceremony. They didn't talk much as the fire caught. He found her a mug and put coffee in it before she'd quite processed that he was making it, and she sat in one of the chairs and wrapped her hands around the mug and let the heat work its way into her fingers, which had gone stiff without her noticing. "How long have you been up here?" she asked. "On this ridge." 7 years, roughly. "Alone?" He sat in the other chair with his own mug and looked at it. "Mostly." She didn't push on that. It had the quality of something with history behind it, and she wasn't owed the history. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "Do you trap all year or just in season?" she asked instead. He looked up, a little surprised. She suspected most people didn't know enough to ask that question. "Mostly late fall through winter, good fur seasons October to March, depending. In the summer I do some work for the survey company out of Hatchet Creek. Track, translate sometimes." "Translate?" "Some of the survey crews need someone who can communicate with the Crow settlements up in the northern range." He said it without any particular pride or apology. Just a fact. "I've got enough of the language for that." She looked at him across the table and reconsidered him slightly. A man who'd learned enough of a language to bridge that kind of gap was not the most expected version of a solitary mountain trapper. She filed that away. "I was a school teacher," she offered. "In Illinois, 6 years." "I know. Holt mentioned it in town some time back, when the arrangement was being discussed." Something tightened around his jaw briefly. He made it sound like a qualification he was generously overlooking. The bitterness of that was so familiar, so precisely named, that she almost laughed. She didn't laugh, but something in her expression must have shifted, because he looked at her differently for just a moment. "That's exactly what it felt like," she said. "To read his letters." He nodded once, drank his coffee. "Well," she said, "for what it's worth, I can teach, I can cook, I can tend animals reasonably well, I can fix basic things and learn what I can't fix. I'm not here to be a burden, Mr. Ronan. I intend to earn my place until I work out what comes next." "You don't have to earn anything," he said. "I know I don't have to." She met his eyes. "I want to. There's a difference." He held her gaze for a moment, then he looked back at his coffee. "All right," he said. The fire in the stove had gotten going properly by now, and the small cabin was warming. Outside the narrow window, the afternoon light was sliding toward gold along the top of the spruce trees. The mountain was quiet in the way that mountains are quiet. Not empty, but full of sounds that are not human sounds, wind and birds, and the particular wooden creaking of large trees moving. She had $3.40 in her bag. She was sitting in a stranger's cabin in the mountains. The man she'd traveled 300 miles to meet had looked at her like she was something he'd ordered wrong and would be returning. She thought about all of this, and then she thought about the warmth in her hands and the coffee that was, she had to admit, very good, strong, and not bitter, made by someone who knew what they were doing. And she thought about Ronan Voss taking his hat off, while everyone around him was watching her fall, which was the smallest possible gesture and which she had not forgotten and would not forget. She would sleep tonight. Tomorrow she would begin. 10. She woke before dawn to the sound of boots on the porch, which meant he was already up, had probably been up for some time. And she lay on the cot in the dark and listened to him move around outside with the quiet efficiency of someone who had lived alone long enough that their morning routine required no internal commentary at all. No whistling, no slamming, just steady, purposeful sound. She lay there for a moment longer, listening, and then she got up. The cabin was cold, but not as cold as she'd expected. He'd banked the stove before he went to sleep, whenever that had been, and there were still good coals. She stirred them and added wood and put the kettle on, and then went to the window and pushed open the shutter. Dawn was coming over the ridge in layers, dark gray first, then a seam of paler gray, then the first suggestion of color along the top edge of the trees. The mountains were enormous in a way she hadn't entirely absorbed the night before, when everything had been arriving at once. Now, with the cold air on her face and the quiet and the light beginning to come, she could look at them properly. They were, and there was no better word for it, tremendous. Not pretty. Not in the way landscapes and paintings were pretty. They were simply enormous and indifferent and very old, and the effect of standing at the edge of a mountain clearing looking up at them was not comfort exactly, but something like proportion. A recalibration. The events of yesterday, Franklin Holt's face, the crowd, the street, still lived in her somewhere and would not be gone quickly. But the mountains put things in a different frame. She heard the porch step and turned. Ronan came through the door and stopped when he saw her, one hand still on the door frame. "You're up," he said. "I'm up." She gestured at the stove. "Kettle's on. I hope that's all right." He looked at the stove and then at her, and something in his expression did that thing again. The not quite smile. The thing that lived on the near side of it. "Yeah," he said. "That's all right." She got 2 mugs down from the shelf. "There's flour," she said. "If you show me where you keep your pan, I can make something before you head out." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not suspicion, not the awkward gratitude people perform when they feel they've been given something they don't know what to do with. Just a kind of careful, quiet taking stock. "Pan's on the hook by the stove," he said. "Flour's in the sack on the bottom shelf." "Good." She found the pan. "Sit down. I need to be useful." He sat down. The first week was the hardest, because it was all adjustment. The cabin's rhythms were not her rhythms yet, and she had to learn them. Not by asking, mostly, but by watching and adapting. She learned that Ronan was up by 4:30 most mornings and out to check his trap lines before full light. She learned that he came back mid-morning and that this was when he ate his largest meal. She learned that he was in the habit of repairing things, the slightly angled shutter, the splitting corner of the work table, the rusted hinge on the storage shed door, with a consistency that meant the cabin was always in a slow state of improvement. She learned that he was a better cook than his kitchen suggested he could be, given the limited supplies, because he was someone who paid attention to what he was doing. She learned that he could go entire half-days without speaking and not appear to notice, but that when he did speak, it was generally worth listening to. She, in turn, took on the things that had obviously been not done. She scrubbed the inside of the window frames and cleaned the lamp glasses so the evening light doubled in quality, and she reorganized the shelf so that the most used items were in front, and she found a sewing kit in her trunk and repaired a split seam in his coat that he'd clearly been ignoring for some time. She got into the habit of having something warm ready around mid-morning when he came back from the trap lines because the trail down and back was cold and wet work even in November, and she had watched him come in twice already, looking like a man who needed something hot before he needed anything else. He didn't comment on these things directly. He noticed them. She could see that he noticed, but he didn't turn them into a conversation. He just said, one morning, when he came in and found the coffee already going and the lamp burning clear and his coat on the hook neatly mended, "You don't have to do all this." "I know," she said. And he sat down and accepted the coffee, and that was the end of that particular exchange. There were difficult moments. On the third night, she woke up at 2 in the morning and couldn't get back to sleep and lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling log by log, and the full weight of her situation came down on her in the way that the dark allows things to come down that you've been successfully managing in daylight. 300 miles from home. No plan. 29 years old, and her one concrete idea for her future had been dismissed in under 30 seconds in front of strangers by a man who decided she didn't meet his visual standards. She thought about that look on Holt's face, the sweep of his eyes over her, the small gesture he'd made that encompassed her whole self, and found it insufficient. She had done nothing wrong. She had written honestly. She had not misrepresented herself. Whatever he'd expected, the failure was his. Either his failure to communicate clearly or his failure to examine his own expectations. And yet she was the one sleeping on a borrowed cot in a stranger's mountain cabin, and he was the one who'd gone home to his glass-windowed house with his pride intact. She lay in the dark and felt angry, which was better than feeling sad, and let the anger be what it was for a while. Then the anger settled, and she was just awake and quiet, and a little cold and alone in the way that isn't fixed by company, the private kind of alone. Outside, the wind moved through the spruce trees. Somewhere farther up the ridge, something called an owl, she thought. She pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes and thought, all right, what are you going to do? Not what are you going to feel, not what do you deserve, what are you going to do? She fell asleep with the beginnings of an answer forming. Eagle. On the 7th day, she walked down the trail to Hatchet Creek on her own. She'd told Ronan she needed to go. He'd looked at the sky, checking weather, she understood now, and said it should be fine and she could take the mare. She'd thanked him and gone, and the trail down had taken her the better part of 2 hours because she was still learning the switchbacks. And when she arrived in town, she was trail-worn and aware that she was trail-worn and made herself not care. She went to the general store first because you always needed to go somewhere first, and a general store was neutral ground. The man behind the counter was older, maybe 60, with a neat white beard and the unhurried manner of someone who'd been in one place long enough to feel no urgency about anything. "Miss Whitlock," he said, without surprise. So he knew who she was. Of course he did. Small towns. "Mr. she said. "Aldrich. Walt Aldrich." He put both hands on the counter. "What can I get for you?" She had her list, and she went through it. Salt, some dried beans, thread in black and brown, a small jar of rendered lard because Ronan's was running low. While Aldrich gathered things, he did not look at her with pity exactly. He looked at her with a quality of careful attention that was trying to decide something. "You've been up with Voss," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "He treating you right?" She met his eyes. "He's treating me well. He's been very decent." The word felt inadequate for what she meant, but she didn't have a better one. "He's been kind in a way that doesn't make a show of itself." Walt Aldrich seemed to find this a satisfactory answer. He nodded and wrapped her purchases. "He's a good man," he said simply. "Doesn't always make himself easy to know, but he's a good man." A pause. Holt, on the other hand, he stopped himself. "Well, you know something about Holt already." "I know enough," Elena said. She paid for her supplies and went to speak to a woman named Clara Marsh, who ran the small lending library out of her front room and who had been pointed out to Elena as someone whose opinion mattered in Hatchet Creek. Clara was 45, brisk and warm in equal measure, and she received Elena on her front porch with a directness that Elena immediately liked. "I've heard about you," Clara said. "Come in. I'll put something on." They sat in Clara's front room among shelves of books that were battered and loved, and Elena told her story plainly. Not the self-pitying version, not the brave version, just the facts as they stood. She was a teacher. She had intended to build a life here. That plan had collapsed. She was reassessing. "We have children who need teaching," Clara said, before Elena had quite finished. "The school runs about 4 months of the year when there's a teacher to run it. Most of the time there isn't. She looked at Elena with the assessing look of someone who has evaluated many people and become accurate at it. You'd be paid. Not a lot, but paid. Elena felt something shift in her chest, something settling into place that had been untethered for a week. I'd like that very much, she said. But, She told Ronan that evening. He was sharpening a knife at the work table when she came in, and she sat down across from him and said she'd been offered the school. He kept his eyes on the knife for a moment. The sound of the blade on the whetstone filled the quiet. That's good, he said. That's really good. There was something in his voice that was more than polite approval. She looked at him. You knew? She said slowly. You spoke to someone. I mentioned to Walt Aldrich, he said, a few days ago, that you were a teacher, that the situation with Holt hadn't been... He set the knife down. I didn't arrange anything. I just mentioned it. She looked at him for a long moment. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his hands on the table, with the particular stillness of a man who's done something he thinks was probably his business to do and is waiting to see if you agree. You could have told me, she said. I could have, he agreed. But then it would have felt like something you got through me, and you needed to go yourself and find it yourself. He looked up then. You deserve to find things yourself. She held that, turned it over. Thank you, she said finally. For both things, the mention and the reason you didn't tell me. He picked up the knife again. Dinner, he said. If you're hungry. She was hungry. She got up and went to the stove. Outside, the mountain wind was picking up, rattling the shutter that still hung at its slight angle, and the temperature was dropping toward what Ronan had said would be the first real cold of the season. Tomorrow she would go back to Hatchet Creek and speak to Clara Marsh about when the school would open. She would work out a schedule and figure out which days she could ride down and which days the trail would be closed by weather. She would begin to build something that was hers. Tonight she cooked dinner in a mountain cabin while the wind came down off the ridge, and the fire in the iron stove burned steady and orange, and the man who had offered her his shelter without asking for anything in return sat at the table nearby and did not fill the silence unnecessarily. And the silence, Elena Whitlock discovered, was something she could live in. Not just live in, something she could begin slowly and carefully and without any promise of how it would turn out to call home. That's it. The first real snowfall came on a Tuesday. Elena knew it was Tuesday because she'd started keeping a small journal. Nothing elaborate, just a few lines each night in a notebook she'd found at the bottom of her trunk, a habit left over from her teaching years when tracking days had mattered. Without it, she thought, the weeks up on the ridge would blur together. The mountain had its own sense of time, which was nothing like the calendar kind, and she was still learning to read it. She woke that morning to a quality of light through the shutter slats that was different from every other morning. Whiter, more diffuse, softer in the way that light gets when it's reflecting off something, rather than falling through air. She pushed open the shutter and a small cascade of snow fell off the outside ledge onto the floor inside, and she looked out at a clearing that had been transformed overnight into something almost unrecognizable. The spruce trees were heavy with it. The woodpile had become a white mound. The trail that she'd been learning, its rocks and roots, and the place where it turned sharply left before the first switchback, had disappeared completely under 6 inches of undifferentiated white. She stood at the window and felt, for a moment, genuinely afraid. Not the sharp fear of an immediate danger, but the slower, more suffocating kind. The realization of how far she was from everything she knew, how completely she depended on systems and knowledge she hadn't fully acquired yet, and how thoroughly the mountain had just demonstrated that it made its own rules. The trail to Hatchet Creek was gone. School had been meant to start in 2 weeks. She had children coming to learn their letters and arithmetic, and she had no way to get down to them, and the man whose cabin she was living in was already outside. She could hear him moving on the porch, dealing with this thing the way he apparently dealt with everything, which was just by beginning. She closed the shutter and started the stove. When Ronan came in, he was brushing snow off his coat and his hat, and he looked at the already going fire with a brief expression that she was learning to read as satisfaction, though it barely lasted long enough to name. Bad? She asked. It's not bad yet, he said. This is the first one. There'll be worse. He hung up his coat and came to the stove to warm his hands. His fingers were reddened from the cold. She noticed he'd split the morning wood already. She could hear the stack on the porch was bigger than it had been last night. Trail's passable, actually, if you take it slow. Ground's frozen solid under the snow, so it's not mud. Mud's what makes it dangerous. She poured him coffee, and he took it without ceremony. I was supposed to start school in 2 weeks, she said. You still can. He sat down. There'll be clear days between now and then, usually a warm stretch in late November before it goes hard for the season. You'll get down. He paused. How many kids are you expecting? Clara said anywhere from 7 to 12, depending on the farms and how willing parents are to send them in cold weather. She'll get them there. Clara Marsh could convince a stone to roll uphill if she decided it was a good idea. Elena laughed, a real one, short but genuine. And the sound surprised both of them slightly, the way a laugh can surprise you when it comes before you've decided to find something funny. Is she someone you trust? Elena asked. He thought about that. She's honest and she's not mean, which out here covers a lot of ground. Yeah, I'd trust her. Good. Elena sat across from him with her own coffee. Because I think I'm going to need her. He looked at her for a moment over his mug. You're not someone who needs much, he said. Not as flattery, more like an observation someone makes when they've been watching carefully. You figure things out. I'm better at figuring things out when I admit I don't know something first, she said. I spent a long time thinking I should already know everything because I'd been teaching other people. Took me a while to see that those are different things. He nodded slowly, like someone filing information away. That's honest. I'm trying to be. She looked at her coffee. It's easier up here, I think. Less to prove. She hadn't meant that to come out quite so plainly, but he didn't seem to know what to do with it, exactly. He went quiet in the particular way he went quiet when something landed near something real, not closing off, but sort of going still, like an animal pausing in a field. Yeah, he said after a moment. It is. They sat with that for a while, and the stove crackled, and outside the snow continued to fall in the silence that snow creates, and neither of them felt the need to fill it. The weeks that followed were an education in how a person actually lives, as opposed to how they think they're going to live. Elena had considered herself capable. She'd been right in general terms. She could cook, she could mend, she could organize. But capable in a schoolhouse in Illinois and capable in a mountain cabin in November were two different things, and the gap between them revealed itself in 100 small and occasionally humiliating ways. The first time she tried to bank the stove properly for an overnight burn, she got the damper angle wrong, and by 3 a.m, the cabin had gone cold enough that she could see her breath. She got up in the dark and rebuilt the fire with stiff, clumsy hands and didn't tell Ronan, who she was fairly certain had heard it anyway and chosen not to say anything, which she was grateful for in a way that was also slightly embarrassing. The first time she tried to bring in the morning wood alone while he was out on the trap lines, she stacked the load too high in her arms and dropped the top third of it, and one log hit the porch step wrong and split. She stood there in the cold and the snow, looking at the split log, and counted to 5 and then picked everything up and went inside and didn't let it be a larger thing than it was. But it sat with her through the morning. There were things she got right. She was a better cook than he was, not in terms of technique necessarily, but in terms of caring about the result. Ronan cooked to sustain himself, which meant his food was functional and sometimes quite good and sometimes just fuel. Elena cooked like it mattered, which meant she thought about what went together and in what proportions. And after she took over the stove entirely, the quality of meals in the cabin improved noticeably. He didn't say much about it, but she watched him eat one evening, a simple venison stew with the dried herbs she'd found in the storage shed and didn't think he'd been using, and he went quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet, more deliberate. Good? She asked. Yeah, he said. A pause. I forgot that was in the shed. I know, I found it behind a sack of oats. She ate. You should use things. He didn't say anything, but the next morning she found that he'd rearranged one of the shelves, not in the way she'd arranged it, but differently, moving things he actually used to the front, making room. It was his way of responding to her. She was learning that about him. He answered in actions before he answered in words. And if you waited for the words, you'd miss half of what he was saying. The school opened on a Thursday in late November, on one of the clear, cold days Ronan had predicted. Elena had ridden down with her saddlebag full of materials. The few books she'd brought from Illinois, a stack of slates she'd ordered through Aldrich's store, chalk, a handwritten curriculum she'd drafted by lamplight over several evenings. The schoolroom was a small wooden building 2 streets back from the main road, empty since the last teacher had left 8 months ago. Clara Marsh met her there with a broom and an apology for the dust and a list of the children who'd be coming. 8 children, in the end. The youngest was 6, a boy named Thomas, who arrived holding his older sister's hand and looking at everything with the enormous cautious eyes of someone who has been told this is important without being told why. The oldest was 13, a girl named May, whose mother had sent her with the particular firmness of a woman who had not had the education she wanted her daughter to have. Between them were 6 others in various combinations of eager and reluctant and shy. Elena stood in front of them and looked at their faces and felt something settle back into place inside her that she hadn't realized was displaced. She had been a teacher for 6 years. This was the thing she knew how to do. Not the only thing she was learning, but one of the true things. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Miss Whitlock. We're going to start with what you know, and we're going to go from there." It went well, not perfectly. Thomas cried briefly at mid-morning for reasons he couldn't explain, and she didn't push on, and 2 of the middle boys had a disagreement over a shared slate that required intervention, and May clearly already knew more than the books in front of her, which was both pleasing and a challenge. But the basics of it, the rhythm of a classroom, the management of multiple minds moving at different speeds, the particular skill of finding the way in to what a child doesn't yet understand, those came back to her fully and without effort. She had missed this without knowing how much. On the ride back up to the cabin, she found herself lighter. Not happy, exactly. Happiness felt like too strong a word for what had changed, but less weighted, like something had been redistributed. Ronan was at the work table when she came in, doing something painstaking with a piece of harness leather and a large needle. He looked up when she came through the door, and his eyes moved over her face with the speed and accuracy that had become familiar to her, reading her the way he read the weather, quickly and without making a production of it. "Good day?" he said. "Yes." She took off her coat and hung it up. "Really good." She turned around. "One of them, the oldest girl, May, she's already passed what I've got for her in terms of reading. I'm going to need to find better books." "Walt Aldrich orders from Denver," he said. "Takes a few weeks. Clara might have something in that library of hers." "I already thought of that. I'll ask her next time." She came and sat at the table. He kept working on the harness. She watched his hands, large, careful, surprisingly skilled for their size. "How were the lines?" "2 marten, 1 beaver." He didn't look up. "Good catches for this point in the season." "Is marten better or worse than beaver?" He glanced up with a brief expression that was somewhere between surprised and amused. "Depends on what you're selling. For fur quality, marten's finer. Better price if the buyer knows his trade." He paused. "You actually want to know about this?" "I live here," she said simply. "I'd rather understand what the work is." He looked at her for a moment, that particular careful look. "Come out tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll show you part of the line." She hadn't expected that. "Really? If you want to see it." He went back to the harness. "It's cold and it's early, and the footing's not always good. But if you want to understand the work, you should see the work." "I'll be up before 4, she said. He almost smiled. "I know you will." But she learned the trap line in pieces, the way you learn anything when someone who does it well decides to actually explain it. He didn't talk while they walked. The snow and the dark demanded attention, but when they reached each set, he paused and walked her through the logic. Why here? What the track said about where the animal had come from, the difference between an effective set and one that was just wishful thinking. He wasn't an elaborate teacher. He didn't use more words than the thing required. But what he said was clear, and he noticed when she understood something without her having to tell him, and he moved on accordingly. She thought not for the first time that he was probably someone who'd learned how to learn on his own, and had consequently become very good at recognizing when another person was doing it. The third set on the line was a quarter-mile from the second, under the roots of a large fallen spruce. He showed her the compressed snow, where something had been moving, the marks that were a particular animal's signature. "Martin?" she said. He looked at her. "Yeah." Not surprised, but something close to it. "How'd you know?" "You said marten were finer boned. The prints are narrower." She pointed. "And there's more of them, closer together. It moves differently." He looked at the prints. "Yeah," he said again, and this time there was something in his voice that was different. Actual respect, the kind that isn't performed and isn't automatic. "That's right." She didn't let herself react to it too much, just noted it and moved on, the way he would. December came in hard. The warm stretch Ronan had predicted lasted exactly a week, and then the real cold descended, the kind that cracked the top inch of snow into a crust and made the morning water barrel a solid block by the time she got to it. She'd started leaving it by the stove overnight, which solved that. She'd also started hanging their coats by the stove in the evening so they were warm when they put them on in the morning, which was a small thing but mattered more than she'd expected. These were not dramatic discoveries. They were just the accumulation of learning how to live in a specific place, which is different from learning how to live in general. The mountain had particular requirements, and she was learning them, sometimes by experience and sometimes by watching Ronan, who had 7 years of muscle memory to draw from and didn't always think to explain the things he'd stopped thinking about. Like the shutter over the south-facing window, which he'd started leaving cracked a particular way in the mornings that she didn't understand until a warm stretch created meltwater on the roof, that ran down, and would have, if the shutter had been closed, pooled on the windowsill and eventually come inside. He did it without comment, the way he did most things. She watched and eventually understood, and after that managed it herself. One afternoon in mid-December, she was working at the table on lesson plans when she heard him on the porch, and then the particular sound, a sound she'd only identified over time, of something being repaired rather than built. When he came in a few minutes later, she didn't look up immediately. "The chimney cap was loose," he said. "If we'd gotten the kind of wind we're supposed to get this weekend, it could have come down." She looked up. "I'd noticed a draft the last few mornings, but I thought it was just the weather." It was both. He sat down and began unlacing one of his boots, which had a split in the upper that he'd been meaning to get to. Could have mentioned it. "I thought I was imagining it." "You weren't." He said it matter-of-factly, without the particular emphasis that would make it a lesson. Just a statement. You weren't imagining it. Trust what you notice. That was the whole message. She wrote it down in her mind somewhere. The wind that weekend was everything he'd said it would be. It came down off the ridge with a sound like something immense moving fast, rattling the windows in their frames and pushing through every imperfect seal in the log walls until the interior of the cabin felt like a sieve. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 12 hours. Elena had never been in cold like it. Not the surface kind of cold that you feel on skin, the kind that is also a sound, also a pressure, also a weight, that makes the body understand viscerally that it is small and temporary, and the mountain is neither. She didn't sleep much. She kept the stove fed through the night, rotating shifts of wakefulness with a stubborn efficiency that surprised her. By 3 in the morning, she had found a rhythm, up every hour and a half, 2 logs, check the damper, back to the cot, and she held it until dawn came gray and wind-scoured and quiet. When Ronan came in from the shed, looking like a man who also had not slept ideally, he stopped in the doorway and looked at the stove and then at her. "You kept it going," he said, "all night." She was tired in the particular way that feels physically dense, like your bones weigh more than usual. "I wasn't going to let it go out." He came and put his hands near the stove and looked at the fire through the grate door. A good solid burn, coals deep and orange. He'd expected to come in and restart it, she could see that. Expected to find it cold or nearly out, and instead it was doing its job and had been doing its job all night. He turned and looked at her, and his face had something on it that she didn't know how to name. It wasn't admiration exactly, or at least not the kind that announces itself. It was something quieter. Recognition, maybe. The look of a person who sees something they understand and didn't expect to see here. "You're good at this," he said, "at figuring out what a thing needs." It was the most he'd ever said about her directly. She felt it land in a way she didn't entirely expect. Not in her chest like a compliment, but lower, somewhere more essential. She looked at the stove. My mother was sick for a long time, she said. You learn to manage what you can manage. You learn to keep the important things going even when you're tired. She paused. A stove is easy compared to that. The cabin was quiet except for the wind noise, diminishing now outside. I'm sorry about your mother, he said, quietly, without the performance that people usually attach to condolences. It was 2 years ago. She looked up. She was a good person. She would have liked it up here, actually. She liked places that required something of you. Ronan looked at her for a moment. So do you, he said. She held his gaze for a beat longer than was strictly necessary. Yes, she said. I do. Christmas came quietly, the way things come when there are only two people and no shared tradition to impose structure on the day. Elena had bought a small bottle of good whiskey from Aldrich's and hidden it in her trunk, which turned out not to be necessary since Ronan had no habit of going through her things. He treated her belongings with the same precise respect he gave every boundary she'd established, which she'd noticed early on and continued to notice. She produced the bottle after dinner on Christmas evening. He looked at it and then at her with an expression that was caught between surprised and quietly pleased. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. That's why I did it. He got 2 cups. She'd tried to find glasses in the cabin and confirmed there were none. And they sat at the table while the stove burned and outside the stars were the winter mountain kind, absurdly clear and close in the cold air. Did you have family? She asked. She'd wondered for weeks and not asked. It felt like the right night to ask. He took a slow drink. Thought about how to answer. A sister, still. In Oregon. He set the cup down. We write sometimes. Not enough. He turned the cup slightly on the table. My father's been dead 20 years. My mother went back east after that, to her sisters. I don't know if she's still... He stopped. I should know that. But you don't. No. She let that sit without filling it. Some silences hold things that conversation would only displace. My family is Margaret's family, Elena said eventually. My sister. She married young and well, and her husband is a good man. Her children are exhausting, and I love them. She paused. She thought I was making a mistake coming out here. Was she wrong? Elena considered the question honestly. About Holt, no. About everything else. She looked around the cabin. The stove. The shelves she'd reorganized. The carved hawk on the upper shelf. The window with the shutter they both now knew how to manage without thinking. I think she might have been. Ronan followed her gaze. His eyes settled on the carved hawk for a moment, then came back to his cup. My father made that, he said. He was better at it than I am. He started teaching me, but he shrugged with one shoulder. 7 years is long enough to get adequate. You made it? A long time ago. She looked at the hawk with different eyes. The real attention in it, the careful working of the wood. A young man learning something from his father, trying to get it right. It's good work, she said. It's passable. But he said it without the total dismissal of someone who genuinely thought it bad, more like someone who knows the distance between what they made and what they were trying to make, and has made peace with that distance, which was, she thought, a kind of maturity. They finished the whiskey slowly and in no hurry, and the conversation moved in and out of words the way good conversation does when the people in it are not performing for each other. She told him about a student of hers from her Illinois years, a boy named Albert, who'd been declared unteachable by 2 previous teachers, and who'd turned out to have a gift for numbers so acute that she'd run out of ways to challenge him within 6 months. He told her about a winter 3 years back when the snow had been so deep he'd been effectively trapped on the ridge for 11 days and had run almost out of coffee, which he described as the true hardship. And she laughed, and the sound filled the cabin, and he looked at her when she laughed in a way that was brief and unguarded, and which she decided not to think about too carefully. The fire burned down to coals. The whiskey was gone. The stars outside were extraordinary. Good Christmas, she said. Yeah, he said. Good Christmas. Basset. January was when the town changed its mind about her. She hadn't been trying to change anyone's mind. She'd been trying to teach children, which was the same thing she'd always done, and the only thing she knew how to do well without trying. But the effect of a good teacher on 8 children, and those 8 children on their families, and those families on their neighbors, is cumulative and not always visible until you're in the middle of it. Thomas, the youngest, the one who'd cried on the first day, had started reading, not struggling through letters, but actually reading, holding a primer and moving through it with the particular intensity of a child who has discovered that a skill has been unlocked. His mother, a woman named Ruth, who worked the farm south of town with her husband and two older boys, came to find Elena at the school one afternoon in January. "He read to us last night," Ruth said. She was a compact, practical woman, the kind who doesn't cry easily, and her eyes were bright in a way she was not entirely managing to control. "The whole supper table. He read from the primer for 15 minutes, and my husband—" She stopped. "My husband said he'd never heard anything like it." Elena thought about Thomas on the first day, holding his sister's hand. "He learns fast when he trusts that nobody's going to make him feel stupid," she said. "That's all. Some children just need that." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "Holt didn't know what he was giving up," she said. It was the first time anyone in town had said anything to Elena directly about Holt since the day of the street. "I want you to know, a lot of us thought it was wrong, what he did. We just didn't—" She shook her head. "Small towns? People don't always speak up when they should." "They don't," Elena said, without bitterness. "Just agreement." "You're good for this place," Ruth said, "however you got here." Elena rode back up to the cabin that afternoon with Ruth's words sitting in her chest in a way she couldn't quite categorize. Not triumph. She didn't feel triumphant. Something quieter, like the satisfaction of a thing taking its proper shape after a long time of looking uncertain. She told Ronan about Thomas that evening, and he listened with the particular quality of attention he brought to things that mattered to her. Not intense, not performative, just present. Real. "Sounds like he was always going to be a reader," he said. "He just needed someone who believed it first." "That's most of what teaching is," she said. He thought about that. "That's most of what a lot of things are." She looked at him across the table. He was whittling, a new piece, something she hadn't seen him working on before, a shape that was beginning to be an animal but wasn't yet identifiable. His hands moved with the same quiet precision that he brought to everything. "What are you making?" she asked. He turned it in his hands. "Not sure yet," he said. "Sometimes I start without knowing. See what the wood says." She watched his hands for a moment. Outside, the mountain evening was going dark, blue and then purple at the tree line. In the stove, the fire they'd both learned to maintain, together, without the division ever being discussed, the way the division of work in the cabin had never been discussed, but had happened anyway, naturally, based on what each of them noticed and moved toward, burned steadily. She thought about Margaret, back in Illinois with her good husband and her exhausting children, who had worried that Elena was making a mistake. She thought about Franklin Holt's sweeping look that had encompassed her and found her wanting. She thought about the stagecoach, 11 days of it, and arriving in a town she didn't know, and standing in the street with her trunk while people watched. She thought about a man taking off his hat. You couldn't plan for the things that turned out to matter. You couldn't anticipate which moment was going to be the one that changed the direction of things, because those moments never looked like themselves until well after they'd already happened. They looked like an ordinary man standing slightly to one side of a crowd. They looked like a cup of coffee in a cold cabin on the first night. They looked like a carved hawk on a shelf, made by hands that were learning, trying to get something right. She picked up the lesson plan she'd been working on. He kept whittling. The fire kept burning. The mountain outside was enormous and cold and very old. It asked nothing of them except that they pay attention, and they were both, in their different ways, learning to do exactly that. Spring came to the ridge the way it always did in the mountains, not with any particular announcement, but by degrees. The snow didn't so much melt as retreat, pulling back first from the south-facing slopes where the afternoon sun hit longest, then from the clearing around the cabin, then finally from the shadowed places under the spruce trees where it had been hanging on with a kind of stubborn last-ditch persistence. The trail down to Hatchet Creek, which had been a negotiation all winter, passable on good days, genuinely dangerous on bad ones, became simply a trail again, muddy in the early weeks, and then firming up as March gave way to April. Elena had been in the mountains for 5 months. She knew this because of her journal, which had grown from a few lines per night into something more substantial. Observations about the trapline, notes on students, the small daily record of a life that had become, without her entirely planning it, genuinely hers. She'd stopped thinking of the cabin as Ronan's cabin that she was borrowing. She'd stopped thinking of Hatchet Creek as the town where she'd been humiliated and started thinking of it as the town where she taught, where Ruth brought her preserves in exchange for extra sessions with Thomas, where Clara Marsh was becoming something between a colleague and a friend, where Walt Aldrich saved the good coffee beans behind the counter for her without being asked. She wasn't sure when that shift had happened. Sometime in January, maybe. Or February, during the week when 3 of her students had come down with a chest cold that spread through their families, and she'd ridden down 4 days in a row, storm weather or not, to check on them and bring what she could. Ruth had said afterward, quietly, that nobody who was going to leave would have done that. Elena hadn't thought about it in those terms when she was doing it. She'd just done it because they needed someone too, and she was the person there. That was the thing about the mountain life that she hadn't expected. It stripped away the question of what you were going to do eventually and replaced it with what needed doing right now, and right now was always enough to fill a day. The eventual had a way of taking care of itself if you kept showing up. She'd stopped asking herself whether she was staying. The animal Ronan had been whittling through January turned out to be a fox. A sitting one, ears forward, with an expression that was somehow both alert and calm. He'd left it on the table one morning without comment, and she'd picked it up and turned it in her hands and looked at it for a long time. It was better than the hawk. Not technically, maybe. The hawk was more polished, more precise, but the fox had something in it that was harder to name. Some quality of having been made by someone who had been paying attention to something beyond just the carving. She set it on the shelf beside the hawk. He didn't say anything about that either, but she noticed the next day that he'd moved it slightly so it was facing the same direction as the hawk, which she thought was probably not accidental. These were the things that constituted a life together without either of them having declared that it was a life together. The shared wood-splitting rotation they'd fallen into without discussing. The way she'd started leaving the lamp at a certain angle that was better for his eyes when he worked at night, and the way he'd started leaving the kindling split finer than he needed to, because she was the one who usually started the morning fire. The understanding, arrived at through no conversation she could remember, about whose side of the cabin was whose and which things in the kitchen were hers to decide and which were his. Two people adapting to each other with the practicality of people who spend most of their time trying to solve actual problems and finding that they were better at it than either had expected. She thought about all of this on the morning in early April when she rode down to town and found, outside the general store, a horse she didn't recognize tied to the post. A good horse. Better than the working horses she knew from the local farms. Polished tack. A saddle that had been bought with money and some care. She didn't think anything of it, specifically. She tied the mare and went inside. Walt Aldrich was behind the counter, and the moment she came through the door, she could see from his face that something had happened. Not the bad news kind of something. Not injury or death. The uncomfortable kind. The kind that involves other people's business landing in your general vicinity. "Morning, Walt," she said carefully. "Morning, Elena." He was doing something with his hands on the counter that wasn't really necessary. "You have any trouble on the trail?" "No, it's drying out nicely." She set her list on the counter. He didn't look at it. "What is it?" He pressed his lips together. "Franklin Holt's back in town." She stood very still. "He'd been up in Billings," Walt continued, moving things on the counter that didn't need moving. "Had some kind of business arrangement up there that apparently didn't go the way he planned. He came back about a week ago." A pause. "He's been talking around town." "Talking about what?" Walt looked at her directly then, with the expression of a man who respects someone enough to give them the honest version. "About how he made a mistake," he said. "How he acted rashly. How he—" Walt stopped. "He's been saying he wants to make it right." Elena kept her face very still. The way she'd kept it still in the street in November, counting her breaths. "Has he?" she said. "He asked about you specifically. About where you were, how you'd settled in." Walt's voice was careful. "I didn't tell him much. Just that you were teaching and doing well. That's public knowledge. There's nothing secret about it." He paused again. He knows you're living up at Voss's place. That's also not a secret. No, she said. It isn't. She was quiet for a moment. Through the store window, she could see the street, the familiar wooden fronts of the buildings, the particular quality of spring light that was sharper and colder than summer but warmer than it had been. She could see the hitching post where the strange horse was tied. Where's he now? Went over to the saloon about an hour ago. Walt watched her. I can tell you it's none of my business, and you can handle this yourself. But I want to say, and I'm only saying it once, that this town remembers what he did to you in November. Whatever he says now, people here have a memory. She met Walt's eyes. Thank you, she said, for telling me. You want your order filled? Yes, she said. Please. She stood at the counter while Walt worked, and she was very quiet on the outside and not particularly quiet on the inside. And she focused on being quiet on the outside because that was the part she could control. She didn't go looking for Holt. She went to the school. Thursday was a school day, and she had 8 children who needed their teacher to show up, regardless of what was happening in the saloon 2 streets over. She taught her morning session, and she did it well because the children deserved her full attention, and she was not going to let Franklin Holt take that from them on top of everything else he'd already taken. During the midday break, while the children ate outside in the pale spring sunshine, Clara Marsh appeared at the schoolroom door. Clara had the look of someone who had been deciding whether to come and had decided. You've heard, Clara said. Walt told me. Elena was cleaning the slates. Has he approached you? He came to see me yesterday. Clara stepped inside. She was a woman who expressed her opinions through the way she stood and moved as much as through words, and right now she was standing with a kind of compressed, directed energy. He wanted to know about you, about your situation, about, and I'm quoting, whether she's settled into something permanent or whether she's still finding her footing. Elena set down the slate. What did you tell him? I told him you were the best teacher this town had seen in 10 years, which is true, and that your personal situation was none of his concern, which is also true. Clara looked at her steadily. What I didn't tell him, because I don't know, is what you're going to do. I don't know either, Elena said. What does Ronan say? Ronan doesn't know yet. She looked at the window, the light. I just found out this morning. Clara was quiet for a moment, which was not her most natural state. The town's watching, she said finally. You know that. People have made up their minds about you, and they've done it based on what they've seen, which is considerable. But Holt still has. He's got history here. Friends. Money. She said it not to discourage, but to make sure Elena was holding the full picture. He can make things complicated if he decides to. He's good at making things complicated, Elena said. He managed to complicate my entire life in about 30 seconds. He did. Claire's voice was not gentle exactly, but it was sure. And I watched you walk away from that and build something real. So did a lot of people. She paused. Don't let him take that from you. I don't intend to, Elena said. But she saw Holt for the first time that afternoon, which she hadn't planned and couldn't avoid. She was coming out of Aldrich's with her filled order when he came around the corner from the direction of the saloon, and the street was narrow enough at that point that stopping would have been more obvious than continuing. So she continued, and he saw her at the same moment she fully saw him, and there was a fraction of a second in which neither of them moved, and the air between them had a particular charged quality, like the air before lightning. He looked the same. Good coat, good hat. He'd put on some weight or lost some. She couldn't quite tell. Travel did that. His face had the look of a man who had prepared for this meeting, which she had not, which put her at a disadvantage she'd have to work around. Miss Whitlock, he said. He'd slowed his pace to give her the option of stopping, which meant the choice of whether to have this conversation here and now was technically hers. She recognized the calculation in it. He was good at calculations. Mr. Holt, she said. She stopped. She'd made the choice. Better here than somewhere she hadn't seen coming. He removed his hat, which she noticed, and which she had complicated feelings about, given that she had seen someone else remove a hat for entirely different reasons, and this felt like a shadow of that. I've been hoping to speak with you, he said. I know, she said. Word travels. Something moved in his face. Not embarrassment exactly, but awareness of being found out. I suppose it does, in a town this size. He held his hat in both hands, which she recognized as a positioning choice, humble petitioning. I'd like to have a proper conversation, if you're willing, not here in the street. The last time we were in a street together, she said quietly, you were considerably less interested in my willingness. It landed. She watched it land. He had the grace, at least, to look like he felt it. That's why I'm here, he said. His voice had dropped, become less performed. That's specifically why I came back. What I did was wrong. I'm not... He stopped, started again. I acted on assumptions that had nothing to do with who you were, and I said things in a public place that I had no right to say, and I humiliated you in a way that wasn't deserved. I know that. I've known it for some time. She waited. There was more. She could feel the shape of it. I'd like to propose, he said, and his voice was back to something more formal now, something prepared. That we revisit the original arrangement. I have a better understanding of what I was looking for, and from everything I've heard, he gestured in the vague direction of the town around them. From everything I've heard, you've become someone that any man in this valley would be fortunate to... Stop, Elena said. He stopped. She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she'd looked at that first moment in the street and seen the sweep of his eyes over her and known, with a clarity that required no translation, exactly what he thought of what he saw. She looked at him now with the same clarity in the opposite direction and tried to find the most precise thing to say, not the most satisfying thing, which were sometimes different. You didn't come back because you understood what you did wrong, she said. You came back because things didn't go the way you expected in Billings, and you came back because you've heard that the woman you dismissed in a street has become someone the town respects, and that stings your pride in a particular way that only one solution fixes. She kept her voice very even. You want to reclaim what you discarded, Mr. Holt? Because the fact that you discarded it, and it became valuable anyway, is something you can't quite tolerate. His expression changed. Something defensive moved across it. That's not... I think it is, she said. And I think somewhere underneath everything you just said, you know it is too. She shifted her packages in her arms. I'm not interested in a conversation about the arrangement. I'm not interested in revising it or revisiting it or giving it a name that makes what happened between us sound like a business negotiation that just needed better terms. She looked at him directly. I built my life here from what was left after you walked away from me in a public street. I built it myself, with my own hands and my own work, and with help from people who gave it freely. That life doesn't have a place for you in it. He was quiet for a moment. The prepared version of himself was gone. She could see it had gone. What was left was just a man, not particularly bad and not particularly good, who had done a genuinely unkind thing and had come back expecting that enough time and a proper speech would settle the account. Voss, he said. The name had an edge to it that he couldn't quite keep out. Mr. Voss offered me shelter when I had nowhere to go, she said, which is more than you did. He's a trapper, Holt said, and she could hear in it exactly what he meant, not just the vocation, but the implication. The social gap, the comparison to what he was and what he could offer and what Ronan was and couldn't. Yes, she said, he is. She adjusted her packages and met his eyes one final time. Good afternoon, Mr. Holt. She walked past him and did not look back. Her hands were completely steady, which surprised her. Her heart was not steady. It was moving at a rate she could feel in her throat. But her hands, holding the packages, did not shake, and she thought about that on the walk to the livery to get the mare, thought about the difference between feeling something and being ruled by it, which was a distinction she'd been learning all winter in ways she hadn't fully named until right now. She told Ronan that evening. She hadn't decided in advance how much to tell him. She'd ridden up the trail with the conversation with Holt, replaying in her head in pieces, turning it over, looking for the parts she'd gotten wrong. There were always parts. And by the time she got to the cabin, she'd decided to tell him the straight version and let him respond however he responded. He was cleaning a rifle at the work table when she came in. He looked up, and she watched his face do the quick assessment it always did, and whatever it found in her expression made him set the rifle down. She sat across from him and told him, Holt's return, what Walt had said, what Clara had said. The conversation in the street, word for word as close as she could manage. because she thought he deserved the actual version rather than a summary. When she finished, he was quiet for longer than usual. "What did you feel?" he asked. "After." She thought about it honestly. "Angry," she said. And then, not clean exactly, but something like it. Like I'd said the true thing, and it landed where it needed to. He nodded slowly. His hands on the table were still. "He's going to try again," Ronan said. "He's not the kind of man who hears the first no." "I know. He'll make it public." His voice was even. "He'll want an audience when he does it. That's how he operates. He needs witnesses. It's the only way the outcome matters to him." She looked at him. "You know him. I've watched him for 7 years." He looked at his hands. "I've seen how he handles things that don't go his way. He'll want it to be a spectacle, because if it's private, then whatever you say to him doesn't reach the people he cares about." He paused. "He cares about what this town thinks of him, more than almost anything." She was quiet for a moment. "You're saying the conversation in the street today wasn't the real one?" "I'm saying he'll try to make the real one happen on his terms, in front of the people whose opinion he wants." She absorbed this. "And what do you think I should do?" He looked up at her then, directly. Something in his expression that she'd only seen a few times, the unguarded version, the one that didn't have the practical, managed quality his face usually wore. "I think you should do exactly what you did today," he said. "Exactly that, just with more witnesses." She held his gaze. "You're not worried?" "About what?" "About any of it. Him." A pause. "He has more than you do by most measures that people use." Ronan looked at her for a moment, and then the corner of his mouth moved in that way that was not quite a smile and hadn't needed to be for months now, because she knew what it meant. "More of some things," he said. She looked at her hands on the table. His hands were 6 inches away. Not touching. They didn't do that. Not yet. Not in any of the ways that would mean something was being declared, but present. Close enough that she was aware of the distance. "I'm not leaving," she said. She said it plainly, without decoration, because that was the only way to say a thing that was this true. "I want to be clear about that. Whatever happens with Holt, whatever he says or does or who he says it to, I'm not leaving." The cabin was quiet. Outside, the spring mountain was full of sounds she now knew. The creek below the ridge running fast with snowmelt, the specific wind that came through the fir trees at this elevation, the sound of the world waking back up after a long winter. Ronan's jaw moved slightly. He looked at the table and then back at her. "All right," he said, in the voice he used when something mattered enough that he was being careful with it. "All right," she said back. He came the following Saturday. She found out through Thomas's mother, Ruth, who appeared at the schoolroom door on Friday afternoon just as the children were leaving, with the expression of someone who has news and has been deciding since morning whether to be the one to deliver it. "He's been talking," Ruth said, after the children were out of earshot. "In the saloon, at the feed store, telling people he made a mistake and he's going to correct it, telling it in a way that—" She stopped. "He's making it sound like you're waiting for him to come back, like it's a done thing." Elena felt the anger again, the clean, locating kind, the kind that tells you exactly where you are and what matters. "When?" she said. "Tomorrow. He said it in front of 6 men at the feed store this morning. He said he was going to square things with you in front of the town." Ruth looked at her steadily. "He's going to make a show of it." "I know," Elena said. "Let him." Ruth studied her. "You're not afraid of him." "I'm not afraid of him," Elena said. "I'm angry at him. Those are different." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "My husband's going to be in town tomorrow," she said, "and Walt Aldrich, and I'll be there myself." She said it simply, without ceremony. "I just want you to know that." Elena looked at this woman who had brought her preserves and who had come to tell her what her son had done, and she thought about the word community, which had meant something abstract to her for most of her life, and now meant Ruth's face in the schoolroom doorway on a Friday afternoon. "Thank you," she said. She rode up to the cabin that evening and told Ronan that it was going to be tomorrow, and he listened and nodded and said he'd come down in the morning, and they had dinner and didn't talk about it anymore because there was nothing more useful to say, and both of them had learned when talking was useful and when it just used up air. That night, Elena lay on the cot. her cot, in the cabin that had become home in the way that real things become real, not through declaration, but through use. And looked at the dark ceiling and thought about the street in November, the trunk on the ground, the crowd watching, the dog that had sat down and observed her misfortune with a dog's complete indifference, the cold and the weight of not knowing what came next. She thought about this man who'd been standing slightly to one side of the crowd, who'd taken off his hat, who'd offered her a roof without asking for anything in return. She thought about what she was now, 5 months later, compared to what she'd been on that street. Not a different person. She didn't believe people became different people. Not truly. More like a more complete version of the same one. The teacher who'd been there all along. The woman who learned to bank a stove correctly and identify marten tracks in the snow and reorganize a shelf so that the things that mattered most were easiest to reach. The person who had come to a place with nothing and made something of it that was genuinely, specifically, irreversibly hers. She was not afraid of tomorrow. She was something else. Something she didn't have a single clean word for. Ready? Maybe? Or simply present, which was the same thing in most situations that counted. Hot. The morning came gray and cool with that thin spring light that hadn't committed yet to being warm. She dressed carefully, not in her best, because this was not a performance and she was not going to dress it up like one. Her second dress, the practical one, the one she wore to teach. She did her hair neatly. She looked in the small mirror Ronan kept on the shelf by the wash basin and decided that she looked like herself, which was exactly what she wanted. He was waiting on the porch when she came out, which meant he'd been up earlier than usual and she hadn't heard him, which told her he was thinking about today in his own way. He looked at her when she came through the door, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. He was wearing his better coat, she noticed. Not his good coat. He had a good coat somewhere for the rare occasions that required it, but the better one. The one a step above working. He hadn't done anything to his hair beyond pushing it back in the way he always did, but the coat was deliberate. She understood what it was, his version of showing up. Not for Holt, not for the crowd, for her. She went down the porch steps and untied the mare. "Ronan," she said. He looked over the back of his horse at her. "Whatever happens today," she said, "I want you to know. The past 5 months have been—" She stopped. Words were doing the thing they sometimes did where they offered themselves but in the wrong sizes. "You changed the direction of things for me, when you didn't have to." He held her gaze across the horses. His expression was the unguarded one, the one that took something out of him to hold for long. "So did you," he said. "For me." She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up. He did the same. The trail down was spring muddy and slow, and the mountains around them were enormous and old and entirely indifferent to what was about to happen in the town below, which she found steadying. They were small. The things that felt enormous were always small from far enough away. It was only when you were inside them that they felt like they might be the whole world. Hatchet Creek came into view around the last bend, the same collection of wooden buildings in front of the same mountains, the same main street she'd stepped into on a November morning with her trunk and her traveling bag and her best dress, expecting one thing and getting something completely different. She looked at it from the ridge trail and felt almost nothing of what she'd felt then. What she felt instead was something like ownership. Not of the town, but of her place in it. Her classroom. Her students. Ruth's kitchen table where she'd drunk coffee in January. Clara's library. Walt's counter where the good beans were kept. Hers. All of it hers. In the only way that things actually belonged to people, which was through the investment of self. She straightened in the saddle. Ronan rode beside her, slightly ahead on the narrow parts, always checking the trail conditions with the automatic vigilance of 7 years of this ridge. The horses' hooves were loud on the frozen ground, and the morning was very quiet around them. And somewhere below in the valley, the town was waking up on a Saturday, and Franklin Holt was there, and he had made plans for today that he was quite confident about. He was about to find out what 5 months on a mountain could do to a woman who'd been underestimated once already, and had decided, quietly and thoroughly, that she was done with being surprised by it. They rode into Hatchet Creek just past 9 in the morning. The street had more people on it than a typical Saturday warranted, which told Elena that Holt had done his work well. Word had spread. Not accidentally, she was certain. He'd wanted an audience, and he'd arranged for one. Men stood in loose clusters outside the feed store and the saloon. Women had found reasons to be on the boardwalk. She recognized Ruth near the front of the general store, standing with her husband, a thick-shouldered farmer named Dale, who nodded once when he saw Elena and Ronan come around the bend. Clara Marsh was there, by the library door, arms folded. Not nervously, but with the particular folded arms quality of someone who has decided to witness something fully and has positioned herself accordingly. Walt Aldrich was on his porch. Elena took all of this in during the 20 seconds it took to ride from the edge of town to the hitching post outside the general store. She kept her face neutral and her pace unhurried, which was harder than it looked because her body wanted to do something, speed up, slow down, react to the weight of all these watching eyes. She didn't let it. She and Ronan dismounted. He tied both horses without being asked, his movements economical and calm. She could feel the attention of the street on them, on her particularly. And she did not look around for Holt because looking for him would mean she was responding to his schedule, and she was done responding to his schedule. She was retying the mare's lead when she heard his voice. "Miss Whitlock?" He'd come from the direction of the saloon, which meant he'd been waiting there, watching for them from inside, she guessed, wanting to time his entrance. He was dressed well, better than either time she'd seen him since he came back. The good coat, a new hat. He looked like a man who had thought carefully about how he wanted to appear today, which she supposed was honest in its way. Appearances were what he understood. He stopped about 10 feet away. The space between them was open. The street, the morning light, the watching town. "I was hoping to see you this morning," he said. He said it at a volume that carried, which she had expected. "I know," she said. At the same volume. She turned around to face him fully. He was doing the thing she remembered, the prepared version of himself, the one that had rehearsed this. He had a quality of settled confidence that was, she recognized, not entirely performance. He genuinely believed he was holding the winning hand here. He'd told enough people enough things that in his mind the outcome had already taken a certain shape, and this was just the confirming of it. "I'd like to speak plainly," he said. "Then do," she said. Something flickered in his expression at her tone. He'd expected she could see a different register. Something more accommodating, more uncertain. He adjusted quickly, the way practiced men do. "I made a serious mistake last November," he said. He turned his head slightly as he said it, the angle that addressed not just her, but the watching crowd. "I acted on first impressions that were," he paused, selecting, "that were unworthy of me. I judged quickly and I judged wrong. And I said things publicly that no man should say to a woman who'd come to meet him in good faith." He looked at her directly then. "I am not too proud to admit that." The street was very quiet. Elena waited. There was more. "I've been watching what you've done here," he continued. "What you've built. The school, the friendships, the—" He gestured slightly, as if indicating the whole of the town around them. "The respect people have for you. I watched it from a distance, and I thought, I knew that I had let something go that I shouldn't have, that I had made a judgment that was wrong, and that it had cost me." He straightened slightly. "I'm here to correct that. I'm offering to honor the original arrangement, to start over properly, to give you the home and the position that you came here for." He said it like a man extending a gift, like the rightness of the offer was self-evident, like the only question remaining was when she'd like to start. The street waited. Elena looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of Ruth's stillness to her left, Walt Aldrich on his porch, Clara's arms still folded, Ronan behind her and to the right, saying nothing, taking up space in the quiet way he did, not inserting himself, but there, solidly, reliably there. She thought about what Ronan had said the night before last, when she'd asked him what he thought she should do. "I think you should do exactly what you did in the street, exactly that, just with more witnesses." She took a breath. Not for composure. She was composed. For clarity. Because she wanted to say the true thing, and she wanted to say it well, not because Holt deserved her best words, but because the people watching did. Ruth and Dale, who had come to stand here on a Saturday morning. Thomas, who was probably somewhere nearby because children always found the thing that was happening whether you wanted them there or not. Clara, who had told her that this town had been watching and had made up its mind. "Mr. Holt," she said, "I want to make sure I understand what you're offering." He nodded, settling into the role of magnanimous man. "I think I've been clear. You're offering me the arrangement," she said. "The original one. A home, a position, a marriage. The thing you invited me 300 miles to accept." "That's right. And you're framing this," she continued, her voice still even, "as a correction, a righting of wrongs. You're presenting yourself as a man with the generosity to look past his first mistake and offer the same terms again, and you'd like me, and everyone watching, to see it that way." He paused. The shape of the conversation wasn't going quite the direction he'd set for it. "I'm presenting myself as a man who can admit when he's wrong." "No," she said. "You're presenting yourself as a man who has reconsidered the value of something he discarded once it became valuable." She said it without heat, just plainly. "Those are different things." The quiet on the street deepened. "I came here in November," she continued, "with my one trunk and my teaching certificates and everything I owned, because you invited me to. I had written you honestly. I had told you exactly who I was. And you looked at me, for less than a minute, in this street, in front of these people, and you decided I didn't meet your expectations. You didn't take me aside. You didn't speak to me privately. You said what you said in public, at full volume, and then you walked away while I stood here with nowhere to go." She paused. Somewhere in the crowd, she could hear the stillness of people barely breathing. "I'm not saying this to punish you," she said. "I'm saying it because you've told your version of that morning to enough people in this town that some of them may have begun to forget the actual version. And the actual version matters." She looked at him steadily. "You were not a man who acted rashly in a moment of confusion. You were a man who made a deliberate public judgment about my worth based on my appearance, and then used this street as your platform for delivering that judgment, because this is where your audience was. And the reason you're using this street now, the reason you made sure word got out and people would be here today, is the same reason. Because your decisions only feel real to you when people are watching." Franklin Holt's face had gone through several expressions in the last 30 seconds and was now resting on something harder. "That's a harsh assessment." "It's an accurate one," she said, "and I think somewhere you know it is." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the prepared version of himself was mostly gone. What was left had a rawer quality. Not quite honest, not quite self-aware, but closer to both than anything she'd heard from him before. "Everything I said was true," he said. "I made a mistake. I came back to fix it. I don't know what else you want from me." "I don't want anything from you," she said. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. There isn't something you could offer that would fix this, because what's broken between us isn't a misunderstanding that better communication would repair. What happened happened. I don't need it fixed. I moved past it." She held his gaze and was careful to make the next thing precise, because it was the most important thing. "You came back here thinking you were returning to a situation you'd left unresolved, but I resolved it. I resolved it without you. The life I have now isn't a consolation version of what I came here to find. It's better. It's mine in a way that an arrangement negotiated through a correspondence service never could have been. And it doesn't have a place in it for you, because I didn't build it with a place for you in mind." The silence stretched. The main street of Hatchet Creek on a Saturday morning in April was the quietest she had ever heard it. Holt looked at her. She watched him work through it. The public failure of this, the exposure of the logic she'd named, the way the crowd's silence had a different quality now than it had when he'd been speaking. He was a man who understood audiences, and he could feel this one shifting the way she could. "Voss," he said. He said the name the way he'd said it on the street the other day, with the comparative weight in it, the implication. She had expected this. "Mr. Voss offered me shelter when I had none," she said. "He asked for nothing. He taught me how to read a trapline, and he split the firewood, and he didn't once make me feel like I owed him anything for the basic dignity of having a roof. That's not nothing, Mr. Holt. That's not a small thing." She paused. "You have more money than he does, and a bigger house, and more standing in town by the usual measures. I'm aware of that. I'm also aware that when I was standing in this street in November with nowhere to go, you were the one walking away, and he was the one who stayed." Holt's jaw tightened. "You've made your choice then," he said, and now his voice was clipped, the graciousness stripped entirely. The real man, finally, with nothing in front of him. "I made my choice a long time ago," she said. "I'm just telling you about it now so there's no confusion." He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he put his hat back on, the gesture of a man concluding something, and he turned and he walked back in the direction of the saloon. Not hurrying, because he wouldn't let himself hurry, but the straightness of his back had a rigid quality that was its own kind of admission. He went through the saloon door, and the door swung shut behind him, and the street exhaled. Elena stood in the middle of the road and felt the quiet settle around her like something physical, like the air after a storm passes. Her hands were still steady. Her heart was not still. It was loud and present and very awake. But the outside of her was composed, and that was the part that had needed to be. She heard a sound from the direction of the general store. Ruth. It was Ruth, clapping. Not theatrically, just twice, firmly, the way you clap when you mean it and not when you're performing meaning. Dale's hand on Ruth's shoulder. Walt Aldrich turning back to his porch door, head slightly bowed, which was Walt's version of approval. Clara, arms finally unfolded with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was more satisfied than Elena had ever seen her face be. She turned around. Ronan was where he'd been, slightly behind and to her right, next to the horses. He hadn't moved during any of it. He'd just been there, still and quiet, the way he was still and quiet through everything that mattered. His hat was in his hands. He was looking at her with the unguarded expression, the one that cost him something and that she had learned to recognize and had come to need to see in a way she didn't entirely know what to do with yet. She walked back to him. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm fine." She considered. "Actually fine. Not the kind I say when I'm not." He nodded. "I know the difference," he said. She looked at him for a moment. The hat in his hands, the better coat, the face that had 7 years of mountain in it, and underneath that something younger, something that had also learned to expect disappointment and had been working carefully and without announcement at unlearning it. "You didn't say anything," she said. "You didn't need me to." "No," she said. "I didn't." She looked down at the dirt street, this specific stretch of dirt that had been the site of the worst moment of her life 5 months ago and was now the site of something else entirely, something she would need time to find the right name for. "But I wanted you there." "I know," he said. "That's why I was." She looked up at him. The spring light was coming properly now, the thin early warmth of an April morning finding its way through the mountain air. Around them, the town was returning to its Saturday, conversations starting back up, people moving again, the ordinary world reasserting itself over the extraordinary moment that had just occurred in the middle of it. "I'd like to go back up," she said. He put his hat on. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go home." The word landed between them, and neither of them moved to examine it, or qualify it, or determine precisely what it meant. It meant the cabin on the north ridge with the iron stove and the 2 carved animals on the shelf, and the south window with the shutter that needed managing, and the trap line through the spruce trees and the trail that she now knew well enough to ride in variable weather. It meant the life she had built with her hands and her stubbornness and 5 months of showing up. She untied the mare. He untied his horse. They mounted up and turned toward the edge of town, and when she passed Walt Aldrich's porch, he raised a hand without looking up from what he was doing, and she raised one back. Ruth was still standing in front of the general store. As Elena rode past, Ruth reached up and touched her arm briefly. Just a touch. 1 second, no words, and then let go. Elena kept riding. The trail north began at the edge of town where the wooden buildings gave way to the first stands of cottonwood, still leafing out slowly in the April cold. She'd ridden this stretch probably 100 times by now, and she still noticed things she hadn't noticed before. The way the creek crossed under the trail at the first mile marker, the particular angle of the slope where the morning sun hit longest, the place where a large rock outcropping on the left meant you were a third of the way up and the worst of the mud was behind you. She noticed all of it, and she breathed and she let the town fall away behind them. They didn't talk on the trail. That was normal. The trail demanded its own attention, and they'd both learned to give it. But somewhere around the halfway point, where the trees closed in properly and the mountain air had that quality of height and cold and clean that she'd never smelled anywhere else in her life, Ronan came alongside her on a wide section, and they rode level for a moment. He won't come back, Ronan said, after today. He's too proud for a third attempt. I know, she said. I thought about that. And? And I don't need him not to come back to feel safe, she said. I needed to say what I said for myself, not to stop him. She paused. Does that make sense? He looked at the trail ahead. Yeah, he said. It does. A beat. You said the true thing in front of the people who needed to hear it. That's not the same as winning an argument. It's better. She thought about that. What's the difference? Winning an argument is about the other person, he said. What you did today was about yourself. He glanced at her. Nobody can take that back from you. Not him, not anybody. She held that for a long moment. The horses moved steadily upward. The spruce trees were dark on both sides, and the ridge above was still winter cold, the last snow still visible on the north-facing slopes. I'm not the person I was in November, she said. Not as a boast, just as a fact, stated plainly for someone who'd had a closer view of the change than anyone. No, he agreed. You're not. He paused. Neither am I, particularly. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the trail, doing the constant low-level monitoring that he always did up here. The automatic reading of ground and sky, and the small signs that told you what the mountain was planning. But his voice had been different just then. Quieter than usual and more deliberate, and she understood that he had said something that had cost something to say. Ronan, she said. He looked over. She didn't have a speech prepared. She didn't have the kind of carefully assembled words she'd had for Holt. Those had been built over months. What she had instead was the truth, which was less polished but more reliable. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I want to be clear that I'm staying because I want to stay. Not because it's the practical choice, or because I don't have somewhere else to go, or because of any version of debt, or arrangement, or negotiation. I'm staying because this is where I want to be. A pause. I'm saying it plainly because I think you need to hear it plainly. He held her gaze on the trail, the horses moving slowly over the uneven ground. I do, he said. Need to hear it plainly. Then there it is, she said. He looked back at the trail. A long moment passed, the kind that holds things without crushing them. I'm not good at saying things, he said. You know that. I know. But He stopped, started differently. When you walked out of that cabin this morning, and you looked the way you looked, like you knew exactly what you were going in to do and you weren't afraid of any of it. He stopped again. The horse picked its way over a rocky section, and he guided it without thinking. I've spent 7 years up here not wanting anything to be different, he said finally. I'd gotten comfortable with it, with nothing being different. He glanced at her. You came and things got different, and it turned out I'd been wrong about wanting that. It was the longest thing she'd heard him say about himself. She knew how much it had cost, which made it worth more than a longer speech from someone for whom speaking came easily. Okay, she said softly. Okay, he said. They rode on. The cabin was another 40 minutes up the trail, and the morning was opening up around them, and the mountain was as large and old and indifferent as it had always been, which was fine, which was, in fact, exactly what she needed. The reminder of proportion, of scale, of the fact that the things that felt enormous were only enormous from close up. From where she was right now, riding up through the pines in April with the cold, clean air and the sounds of the mountain around her and a man beside her who had shown her, over the course of 5 months, that decency was not a transaction and kindness did not require an audience. From right here, the things that had felt like the whole world in November were exactly the right size. Small enough to name. Small enough to put behind her and not look back at. She straightened in the saddle and rode toward home. Franklin Holt left Hatchet Creek 11 days after the confrontation in the street. Elena heard about it from Walt, who mentioned it the way he mentioned most things, plainly, without editorializing, as a fact that had occurred and was now part of the record. Holt had sold his remaining interest in the valley grazing lease to a rancher from 2 towns over, loaded what he needed onto a hired wagon, and gone north. Nobody knew exactly where. Nobody asked particularly hard. She was at the school when Walt told her, between lessons, standing in the doorway with the spring air coming through. She nodded and thanked him for letting her know, and then she went back inside and helped May work through a passage in a book Clara had lent them, a collection of essays on natural history that was well above the standard curriculum and exactly right for a 13-year-old whose mind was running faster than the materials available to feed it. She thought about Holt once more that afternoon, briefly, and then found that she didn't particularly need to think about him again. Not out of satisfaction, not out of victory, just because he had taken up a certain amount of space in her mind for months, and now that space was available for something else, and there were better things to fill it with. That was the quiet truth of it. She had expected his departure to feel like something more, a punctuation mark, a closing. Instead, it felt like a Tuesday. Life had developed its own forward momentum, and his leaving was just a fact in the middle of it, the way any obstacle cleared is less dramatic from the other side than it looked approaching. She was teaching again on Wednesday, and the rhythm of the days continued without interruption. The proposal happened in May, and it was not romantic in any conventional sense, which was fitting. They were on the trap line. She'd taken to going with him once a week since the spring sets, partly because she'd come to find the work genuinely interesting, and partly because the hours on the trail with him were the best kind of hours, the kind where nothing needs to be performed. He was checking a set under a deadfall, and she was waiting with the horses, watching a hawk work the thermal above the ridge, when he came back and stood beside her and looked at the hawk too for a moment. "I've been thinking," he said. She waited. He thought before he spoke, always, and interrupting his lead-up was a good way to get a shorter version than he'd intended. "I've been thinking," he said again, "about how things are." "And how are things?" she said. He looked at the hawk. "Good," he said. "Better than they've been in a long time." He paused. "I think we both know that what's been happening up here is—" He stopped, started differently. "I don't want there to be any ambiguity," he said. "I've been ambiguous my whole life about most things, and I don't think it's served me well." He turned and looked at her directly, the unguarded expression, the one that cost him. "I want to marry you, if you want that too." It was not a speech. There was no particular setting for it. Just a trap line in the spruce trees on a May morning, with the horses behind them and the hawk above, and the ground still soft from overnight rain. He had not planned the moment for its aesthetics. He had simply arrived at a point where not saying the thing was less honest than saying it, and so he had said it. She looked at him. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was holding something carefully. His hands at his sides were very still. "I want that too," she said. Something in his face settled. Not relief exactly, but the release of a held tension, a quiet unlocking. He nodded once. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He turned back to the line, and she turned back to the horses, and they finished the morning's work in the companionable silence that had become the fabric of their shared life. And on the way back down the trail, she started to smile at nothing in particular, and caught him watching her do it and didn't stop. They told Clara first, because Clara would find out anyway, and it was better to tell her than have her find out sideways and feel excluded. Clara received the news with the expression of someone who has known something was going to happen for a long time and is experiencing the specific satisfaction of being right. "Finally," she said, and then poured them both coffee without asking. They told Ruth and Dale on a Sunday when Elena rode down for dinner, which Ruth had started insisting on once a month as the winter passed, and they had all become something closer than neighbors. Ruth cried, briefly, and pressed her hands over her mouth, and Dale stood up from the table and shook Ronan's hand with a kind of firm formality that was the most expressive Elena had ever seen him be. "Good man," Dale said. "Trying," Ronan said. Walt Aldrich, when told, looked at Ronan for a long moment and then looked at Elena and said, "You were always better than what you arrived to." He meant it as a compliment, and it landed as one, which said something about Walt's particular economy with words. The wedding was in June, on a clear morning before the real summer heat came. They discussed it, practically, the way they discussed most things, and agreed on small. Not small because they were hiding anything, or because either of them was ashamed of the other. Small because neither of them needed the performance of a large event to know what the thing meant. They'd both lived long enough to understand the difference between the ceremony and the commitment, and the commitment was already there, had been there for some time, had been built not in a single moment, but in 100 ordinary ones. Clara's front room, because it had the most books, and Elena had decided that if she was getting married, she wanted to do it somewhere that felt like herself, rather than somewhere that looked correct. Clara had put wildflowers on every available surface. Not arranged, just gathered and placed, which was what wildflowers needed. And the June light through the windows was the kind that makes a room look like it's been lit from the inside. 8 people: Clara and Walt and Ruth and Dale. May, who had asked to come with a directness that Elena found impossible to refuse, and who stood in the corner looking very serious throughout, as though she understood she was witnessing something important. 2 other neighbors from the valley who had become genuine friends in the months since spring. And Thomas, who was there because his mother brought him, and who spent the ceremony studying the bookshelves with the intensity of a child who has discovered what reading opens up and cannot stop. The man who performed the ceremony was a justice of the peace named Halverson, who rode out from the county seat, a large bearded man who took his role seriously without taking himself too seriously, which Elena approved of. He kept it short. He asked them each what they were committing to, and they told him, in their own words. He didn't require a specific script. And then he said the necessary legal words, and that was it. Ronan's hand in hers was warm and calloused and not at all nervous, which she found steadying. Her own hands were slightly nervous, which she thought was fair. It was a significant thing, and the fact that it felt right didn't make it less significant. He put on her finger a ring he'd had made by the silversmith in Billings. Simple, nothing elaborate. A band with a small etched pattern that she recognized from the fox he'd carved. She had to ask him later if that was intentional, and he had looked at her like the question answered itself. When Halverson finished, Thomas looked up from the bookshelf and said, with the honest confusion of a 7-year-old, "Is that it?" And the room laughed, all 8 of them at once, including Ronan, which was the sound Elena would remember longest from that morning. The full room of it. The way Ronan's laugh, still rare enough to be notable, still a thing she counted when it happened, joined the others without reservation. "That's it," she said to Thomas. "Oh," he said, and went back to the books. They returned to the cabin that evening. The valley had gone gold in the late summer light, and the trail up was dry and easy, and they rode it without hurry because there was no hurry. The clearing came into view the way it always did, the log walls and the covered porch and the woodpile and the storage shed and the spruce trees closing in on 3 sides. The same collection of simple structures she'd seen for the first time 7 months ago, standing in the doorway of a freight wagon, thinking, well, here you are. She swung down from the mare and stood in the clearing and looked at it for a moment. He came and stood beside her. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just looking." He looked at it with her, the 2 of them standing in the clearing in the June evening. "We should fix the south shutter properly," he said. She laughed again. "We really should." "Maybe next week." "Maybe next week," she agreed. They went inside. She put the kettle on. He took off his coat and hung it on the hook beside hers. They'd been hanging there side by side for months, which seemed suddenly, in a way she was probably being sentimental about, like something that had known what it was before they did. On the shelf, the hawk and the fox sat facing the same direction. Between them, she'd placed a small, smooth river stone that she'd found on the trail in March, and kept for no reason she could fully articulate except that it was the right shape for holding. She had stopped needing to articulate reasons for things that simply felt true. The summer moved the way good summers do, with a fullness that you only appreciate looking back, when you can see that you were actually present for most of it, rather than thinking about something else. She taught through July, when a handful of farm children whose parents wanted them to keep up came twice a week. She rode the trapline with Ronan on the days he checked the summer sets. She wrote long letters to Margaret, her sister back in Illinois, who had received the news of the marriage with a complicated silence, and then, 2 weeks later, a letter that began with, "Well, I suppose I wasn't entirely right about everything," and then became gradually something warm. She had been right about Holt, Elena admitted in her reply, wrong about everything else. Margaret wrote back, "I'll accept that. Are you happy?" Elena sat with that question for longer than she expected. Not because the answer was complicated, but because she wanted to give an honest answer rather than an automatic one, and the honest answer required some thought. She was not happy in the effortless, uncomplicated way of people who have never struggled with anything. She was happy in the way of someone who has come through something real and found, on the other side of it, a life that fits the actual shape of who she is rather than the shape other people imagined for her. That was a different kind of happy. Sturdier, maybe. Less surprised by itself. She wrote back, "Yes, the complicated kind. The best kind, I think." By August, the school had expanded. It happened without anyone formally deciding it. May had been coming in the summer sessions and had begun on her own initiative helping the younger children with their reading while Elena worked with the older students on arithmetic and geography. She was good at it, patient in a way her age didn't suggest, with a quality of genuine attention that Elena recognized as the core of the thing. One afternoon, Elena had watched May sit beside Thomas and explain a sentence to him 3 different ways until the one that worked found its way in, and she'd thought, there is a teacher there already. It just needs a proper name. She'd spoken to May's mother about it, a quiet, hard-working woman named Agnes, who had the look of someone who had been pouring herself into her children's futures for a long time and was occasionally exhausted by it. Agnes had listened and then asked, with careful practicality, whether there was something in it for May beyond the work. In a few years, Elena said, she could be the teacher here, a paid one. I'll still be here, but this valley needs more than one school eventually, and she's already better at some of this than I was at her age. A pause. But that's years away. Right now I'd like to pay her from the school fund for the summer sessions if the town agrees, which I think they will. Agnes had looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been underestimated enough times to know the value of someone who doesn't. Yes, she said. All right. Clara's reaction, when Elena told her, was to immediately start making a list of additional books she could acquire through the Denver supplier. Walt raised the school fund allocation at the next town meeting without being asked. Ruth brought preserves to the school in September, which was her love language, and everyone understood it as such. The valley was doing what valleys do when something takes root and grows. It organized itself around the new thing as though it had always been there. On a September evening, when the first cold was beginning to come back down off the ridge, and the aspens were going yellow at the higher elevations, Ronan came in from a long day checking and resetting the fall lines and found Elena at the table with her journal. Not writing, just sitting with it open, looking at the pages. He poured himself water from the barrel, leaned against the counter and looked at her. "What are you reading?" "November," she said. He came over and looked. She'd let him, which meant she wasn't self-conscious about it, which was its own kind of intimacy. The kind you don't notice you've arrived at until you're already there. He read the first entry, the one from the night of the first day. She watched his face as he read it. Arrived. Different from expected in both directions. He looked up. "Both directions," he said. "It was worse than I expected in the obvious ways," she said, "and better than I expected in the ways I didn't know to look for." She closed the journal. "I was trying to be fair to the day." He put his hand on the journal without opening it, just rested it there for a moment. "You were standing in that street," he said, "and I don't know what I thought exactly, just that it was wrong, what he did." He moved his hand. "I didn't think it would come to any of this. What did you think would happen?" "That you'd find your footing and figure out your next step and leave in the spring," he said. "That's what I told myself." He looked at her. "I was wrong about that from fairly early on, but I took a while to notice." She looked at him. This man who was not easy or simple, who said hard things in short sentences and felt things quietly and deeply, and sometimes needed a week to say what he'd understood on Monday, who had carved a hawk when he was young and missing his father and put it on a shelf in a mountain cabin where it had waited for years to be recognized. "When did you notice?" she said. He thought about it honestly. "When you kept the stove going all night in the December storm," he said. "When I came in and the fire was going and you were sitting there tired as anything and you didn't make anything of it." A pause. I thought, there is someone who does what needs doing without needing it noticed, and I thought that was rare." She looked at her hands. "I needed it noticed a little," she said. "I just wasn't going to say so." He made the sound that was close to a laugh. "I noticed," he said. "I was just also slow to say so." "We are a pair," she said. "We are," he agreed. Outside, the September evening was coming down in layers, the way mountain evenings came, color first, then purple, then the enormous clarity of a high-altitude dark full of more stars than any reasonable sky needed. Inside the cabin, the fire was going because they'd both started keeping it going from habit, not from cold. The shelf held the hawk and the fox and the river stone and 3 books that hadn't been there in November and a small, dried sprig of something she'd picked on the trail in July. The coats were on their hooks. The table was scratched from 7 years of use and would be scratched for more years still. The shutter on the south window had been properly rehung in late June, finally, and no longer hung at its slight angle. She'd found it fixed one morning without ceremony, which was how Ronan fixed things. The first snow of the new season came in October, and Elena was ready for it. Not because she'd prepared better, though she had. She knew the signs now, the particular quality of late afternoon light, and the smell of the air and the low clouds moving in from the northwest that meant snow before morning. She was ready for it because she knew what to do when it came. She knew the damper and the kindling and the morning barrel and the way the trail changed in the first inch of fall snow versus the packed winter kind. She knew the cabin's cold spots and the stove's particular personality and the pattern of wind that came off the ridge and which corner of the woodpile to pull from first. She woke the morning after the first snow and lay still for a moment, listening to the silence that snow creates, and then she got up and started the fire before Ronan was back from the shed, and she had coffee going and the cabin warm by the time he came through the door. He looked at the stove and at her. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He hung up his coat and sat down, and she put a mug in front of him and sat across from him. Through the south window, the properly hung shutter cracked just right, the way they both knew to crack it in certain weather. The new snow on the clearing was blue-white in the early light, and the spruce trees were heavy with it again, and the whole mountain above was changed and muffled and enormous and perfectly itself. She thought about the stagecoach. 11 days of it, pulling into a town she didn't know, about standing in a street with her trunk and her best dress and the wrong expectations and the right stubbornness, about a man taking off his hat. She thought about how much she had come into this valley looking for and how little of it she had found, and how what she'd found instead was better in the ways that you can only understand after the fact, when you have enough distance to see the shape of the thing clearly. She had not gotten the life she planned. She had gotten the one she was capable of building when the plan fell apart, which turned out to be more than she'd known she was capable of. That wasn't a comfortable lesson. It was only available on the other side of genuine failure, which meant you couldn't acquire it any other way. You had to lose the plan first. You had to stand in the street first. You had to have nowhere to go and then decide, in the absence of a script, what kind of person you were actually going to be. The fire burned steadily. The coffee was good. Her husband sat across from her in the early morning quiet, unhurried, present in the way he always was. Outside, the mountain went on being what it had always been, large and cold and indifferent and extraordinarily beautiful, in the way of things that require nothing from you and give you everything anyway if you pay attention. She had learned to pay attention. She was still learning. She expected she would be for a long time. "Long winter ahead," Ronan said. She wrapped her hands around her mug. "Good," she said. And she meant it. She meant it completely. The woman who arrived with one trunk and nowhere to go became the teacher this valley would remember for a generation. The man who lived alone on the North Ridge long enough to forget what he was waiting for found out he'd been waiting for something specific after all. Neither of them could have predicted the other. That's the thing about the life you actually get. It doesn't ask your permission. It just shows up one day on the stage road, covered in dust, and waits to see what you'll do.
Self-defense. Yeah, you fucking kidding me, man? Dude, there's fucking 3 turrets in that room!
You got that? I'll be back. You got that.
You're right, bro. You're right. I got it. Just in case I don't. Wow! Oh shit! Ooh, there's stop sign. Do. What the hell is that? Weird. Oh, we collected bin. Nice. Well, money's gotta get made. You know what I mean? And we gotta get paid. You know what I'm saying? So, someone's gotta be out here making shit happen. Watch this. Take off. I'm dead. Whoa! I'm too good. I'm too good. I'm too good. I'm too clean with it. Too fucking clean with it. Oh shit. That's doable. Oh shit. Oh. Okay, we're gonna wait till that moves over. What the fuck is that?